Hello everyone. Welcome. Good morning to most of you, and good afternoon to Matthew and anyone else who might be joining us from other time zones. So thank you so much. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nida Rahman. I am an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at CMU. And today's lecture is part of the project and the speaker series called Spaces of Containment and Care on the Spatial Politics of Infectious Diseases and Health, which is supported by the CMU Center for Arts in Society. And this lecture today is also part of my class, my seminar class, Space, Health and Justice. So I'm happy to see some students here as well. And today, for this final lecture, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Matthew Gandy, who is joining us today from Hamburg, from Germany. Professor Gandy is a cultural, urban, and environmental geographer and a professor of geography at the University of Cambridge, and he's also an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Professor Gandy's wide-ranging and truly interdisciplinary scholarship spans urban environmental history and cultural landscapes, urban political ecology, infrastructures and urban metabolism, biodiversity and the urban Anthropocene, post-humanism and cyborg urbanization, as well as urban epidemiology, which he's going to talk to us about today. He's the author of a number of books published by MIT Press, which include Concrete and Clay, Reworking Nature in New York City, which won the 2003 Spiro Kostoff Award. The Fabric of Space, Water, Modernity in the Urban Imagination, which won awards from the Association of American Geographers and the International Planning History Society. And most recently, Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space, which builds on his work directing the European Research Council Advanced Grant Project, Rethinking Urban Nature. And the book, which is fantastic, which explores urban nature across various international contexts and cities, including London, Berlin, Tallinn, Chennai. And in particular, it draws from ecological, feminist, post-colonial, and post-humanist thought to raise questions about urban biodiversity and spontaneous nature in post-industrial urban landscapes. So of course, it has many lessons for us here in Pittsburgh. Professor Gandy also directed the film Natura Urbana, which was released in 2017, and it examines the post-war history of Berlin through its plans and also through the emergence of urban ecology as a particular distinctive field of scientific and botanical research. Professor Gandy has been a visiting scholar at Columbia University, UCLA, Newcastle University, and in Berlin at the Technical University, Humboldt University, and the University of the Arts. He was the founder and the director of the UCL Urban Laboratory and is founder and co-founder of the Urban Salon. From 2013 to 2018, he was the co-editor of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. He was elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2015 and Fellow of the British Academy in 2016. Professor Gandy is also actively involved in local issues in Hackney in East London, where he lives, and he's a member of the Hackney Biodiversity Partnership and Sustainable Hackney. Across his work, he really helps us to think deeply and in very nuanced ways about the multifaceted meanings, processes, and politics of urban nature. And I was extremely privileged to have worked with Matthew as his PhD student at Cambridge. And for me, one of the really important lessons of many of his work has been to kind of stay close to the empirical realities and contingencies of particular places, to learn to cultivate different forms of attunement, even to the most mundane aspects of the urban environment, as well as to their broader socio-ecological assemblages. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to him. But just before I do so, I want to request everyone to please ensure that you stay muted during the talk. There'll be time for a question and answer and a discussion after the lecture. Please feel free in the meanwhile to use the chat function to add questions. We're also recording the talk today. So with that, please join me in a really warm welcome for Professor Matthew Gandy.
Okay. Thanks so much, Nida, for that very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to now try and share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks very much for this opportunity to talk about some of my current work framed around what I've referred to as the Zoonotic City, which links to some of my long-standing interests in urban epidemiology. And I think partly, perhaps you could say even provoked by the coronavirus global pandemic, I went back to some of the key arguments and developments surrounding zoonoses and urbanization to try and develop my own perspective about the situation that we're in, but also put it in a historical and geographical perspective. So as a starting point then, I think that I would like to raise a couple of important interventions, particularly from anthropology. The work of Christos Linteris I found extremely interesting, and his elaboration of the idea of the pandemic imaginary that I will be coming back to from a highly interdisciplinary perspective. And also the work of the anthropologist Maaike Wolf, who really ahead of her time was really bringing questions of anthropology together with the matter of zoonoses. And just to put in simple terms, really, zoonotic diseases are passed from animals to humans, and around 2/3 of human diseases are likely to be zoonotic in origin. So the whole question then of zoonoses and zoonotic urbanization is really critical to understanding fundamental aspects of human history and public health. Within this context, Christos Linteris has remarked that the zoonosis itself has been recently transformed into a charismatic epistemic thing. And on this question concerning the zoonotic city, I would want to emphasize from a historical perspective that cities have always been, to a significant degree, zoonotic since the earliest human settlements. So we're looking at, if you like, a long history in relation to a number of these developments. But we're also at the current moment, I think, entering a particularly intense moment of uncertainty and fragmentation in relation to public health discourses. And in particular, and I'll return to this point, in particular, a kind of confident, optimistic global perspective in the field of public health has come under sustained pressure. And we could, I think, argue that in the contemporary context, in terms of the increasing significance of new and emerging diseases, we're potentially and arguably moving into a distinctive new phase, which requires a careful reflection on our analytical approaches. Now, this particular question then about the emergence of new or little known viruses and other pathogens through mechanisms of zoonotic transfer is related to a range of organisms, but arguably bats in particular, since they harbor such a large number of potentially zoonotic viruses, many of which are not known or described within contemporary science. And when we talk about zoonoses and zoonotic spillover zones or zoonotic transfer zones, there appear to be two global epicenters, that is West Central Africa and South Asia, And these zones of zoonotic transfer also coincide with extensive biodiversity hotspots, which are under intensifying threats of environmental destruction. However, I want to point out that potentially dangerous zones of zoonotic transfer are not restricted to the global south. The emphasis on zoonotic transfer zones has been predominantly within the global north, within global south, but we need to be aware that there are zones of zoonotic transfer within the global north as well. And this cartoon from 1996 from the British newspaper, The Guardian, is in response to what's sometimes referred to as mad cow disease or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which emerged first in the UK in the 1980s and was traced to the deregularization of animal feed, in effect feeding offal and animal brains back to animals, creating the context for a potential zoonotic transfer situation. And in this cartoon here, those of you who study British politics closely will perhaps recognize Margaret Thatcher in this microscope slide in the middle, the then Agriculture Minister John Gummer on the left, and the Prime Minister John Major, bottom right here, floating about. This sense then of a deregulation being a context for the transfer of zoonotic disease. Another facet in the global north is the intensification of factory farming methods, and the H1N1 swine flu pandemic of 2009 is traced to the UK beef, the North American factory farm system for swines and hogs. So I just wanted to put that in there just to emphasize that we're talking about a global dynamic of zoonotic transfer zones. So in terms of the structure of today's presentation, I want to look at four things in particular. I want to begin by talking about the decentering of urban epidemiology and the degree to which a heavily Euro-American perspective, we could say, has really framed the way we look at key moments of epidemiological transition. I want then to look at the question of zoonotic urbanization in more detail, to think about what the parameters of the Zoonotic City might be. And then thirdly, I'm going to look at some of the debates surrounding scale and rescaling urban epidemiology. And then finally, I want to return to this question of the pandemic imaginary as a way of making sense of our contemporary predicament. So the question then of decentering urban epidemiology. So in terms of decentering urban epidemiology then, we can think in terms of conventional periodizations. And there are really three epidemiological transitions that stand out. The first of these is associated with the early Neolithic period and the first human settlements and early attempts to domesticate animals. And through this early period of urbanization, diseases such as plague, tuberculosis, and rabies begin to play a significant role within human history. A second transitional phase is normally framed by the growth of industrial cities and the impact of disease pandemics such as cholera, typhus, and yellow fever. And cholera, for example, has been closely associated with absent or dysfunctional urban infrastructure systems and squalid living conditions. And then a third and more recent transition spans an increase in chronic lifestyle-related sources of ill health, rising levels of pathogenic resistance to existing treatments, and also the increasing significance of new and emerging diseases, including Ebola, HIV, SARS, and of course, COVID-19. Now, this existing epidemiological typology is clearly highly Eurocentric, or at least more recently Euro-American in terms of its analytical framing. And I would suggest that we certainly need to add another critical epidemiological transition, which is associated with the European contact with what was called the New World and the genocide of indigenous inhabitants of the New World, principally through disease, but also violence, slavery, and extension of plantation agriculture, mining, and other extractive frontiers. This dramatic moment of violence and genocide also had epidemiological consequences in both directions. It's thought that syphilis, for example, was, if you like, a reverse transfer from the so-called New World back to Europe. So we have a complex set of developments then associated with an additional epidemiological transition that we need to add into our framework to provide a more global picture. And this violence and genocide associated with the expansion of European colonialism also coincides with other markers such as the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene as an alternative terminology to the Anthropocene. So it's an interesting field of debate in itself in terms of what the specific zoonotic connotations of the Plantationocene might pertain to. So thinking then about an expanded conception, if you like, of epidemiological transitions, I want to look at a couple of examples. The global spread of HIV, we can relate to patterns of colonial capitalist urbanization and this analytical marker of the Plantationocene. And an element here in relation to the Plantationocene is the expansion of global rubber production within European colonial expansion. And in this sense, we can begin to piece together some of the jigsaw pieces behind the emergence of HIV as a regional and then a global pandemic. There is certainly evidence of HIV from blood serum from the early 20th century, and there appear to be clusters related to intensified transport infrastructure and regional colonial urbanization in relation to plantation agriculture and rubber being one of the main commodities. And within this context then of colonial urbanization, it's also that the European introduction of syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases may in themselves have helped to spread HIV. So we have a complex set of epidemiological interchanges in play within the context of colonial patterns of urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa, so that now we have a lot more detailed evidence about the gradual spread of HIV in, for example, colonial Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, long before recorded cases in Los Angeles, San Francisco, or other cities in the global north. And additionally, in relation to the spread of HIV, there is interesting historical research on medical practices and the sharing of syringes by colonial health authorities and other contributory factors in colonial West Africa. So I just wanted then to use that example to give a sense of the complexity of what we understand by these broad-based epidemiological transitions. I want to move on to consider the question of zoonotic urbanization and what this conceptual term might encompass. I think one of the first points to consider then is what exactly constitutes the urban? And this was the precise question that the anthropologist Maike Wolf asked in her key essay published in 2016. And it relates to a number of debates more broadly within urban studies, urban geography and cognate fields right now, in terms of a sense of what do we actually mean by the urban? If we look beyond the city as a geographically or administratively bounded entity, then what other relations, landscapes or mobilities form part of an expanded conception of the urban? And certainly within urban studies, there's been a lot of debate around what you might refer to as neo-Lefebvrean conceptions of complete urbanization. But I want to, at this point, raise a question, however, that I think that when we look at the field of urban epidemiology, I would suggest that a highly generalized or globalized conception of the urban can be counterproductive in terms of making sense of the microecologies of urban epidemiology, precisely the kind of arenas actually that Nida has been working in Lahore. So how do we reconcile then the local specificities with global dynamics of urbanization? I think it's a real analytical challenge. Nevertheless, in terms of zoonotic urbanization, there are various examples and developments that we can point to, which are extremely important for us to reflect on, in terms of intersections between zoonoses, corporeal vulnerability, and urban epidemiology as they relate to the shifting ecologies of disease vectors. First identified in Uganda in the late 1940s, which is spread by mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti in particular, and with the spread of the vector to Central and Latin America, Zika virus suddenly became a major focus of public health concern. But among the many interesting questions that can be raised in relation to the Zika virus are the microecologies within which the insect vectors can thrive, particularly poorer neighborhoods, but also the chaotic response of public health authorities with these high-profile, as a biopolitical displays of power, insecticide spraying programs and things of that kind. So that these public health crises then are never simply about the simple epidemiological dynamics of disease vector, but a whole host of other contributory factors and developments. Another example is the West Nile virus, which is also related to specific kinds of topographies of urbanization, and some very interesting examples stemming from cyclical processes of disinvestment and abandonment, and abandoned swimming pools in the wake of the North American foreclosure crisis provided a perfect environment for the Culex pipiens insect vector to thrive. And here I think is another interesting entry point potentially for urban political ecologies and metabolic explorations of the flow of capital through urban space and the creation of particular kinds of micro ecologies, to use Nida's expression again. So the emergence then of new mosquito landscapes. And then another related example of a mosquito-borne disease, which is extremely important for us to consider, is that of dengue fever, which has been steadily spreading since the early 1950s, and very interesting example of zoonotic urbanization. The first major outbreaks of dengue in Manila in the early 50s, and again in 1956, then again in Bangkok in 1958. First major outbreaks, that is, within the global south, signaling the beginnings of a global pandemic, which has multiple factors, again, in terms of the micro topographies that allow the the vector Aedes aegypti, again, the same vector for Zika, to flourish. But there are 4 different serotypes of dengue fever, and dengue fever itself has been undergoing a degree of evolutionary change and recombination between different serotypes. And dengue fever is very interesting from an epidemiological perspective because it's a disease that has become worse and more threatening. And this narrative that we see in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, that inevitably disease has become more benign and not something to worry about. Dengue provides a counter example, which is extremely important to consider. Also, dengue, like Zika, has been responding to climate change and the creation of additional circumstances within which the insect vectors can breed. And in fact, in relation to many of these insect-borne diseases, the insect vectors are present in an extended geographical range beyond where the disease is currently recorded. And that's another element of uncertainty in terms of the future of urban epidemiology. So malaria-carrying mosquitoes are present in parts of Europe without malaria, but with a change of circumstances, malaria can return, as happened in Greece in the wake of the recent austerity crisis. So I wanted also to mention, in the context of new and emerging diseases, Ebola provides yet another extremely important example of a disease which appears to have transitioned, if you like, from predominantly rural disease to a significant urban disease through the most recent outbreak, which was a matter of global public health concern. But here again, I think we need to be careful of this distinction between the rural and the urban in terms of the zoonotic accelerator landscapes of environmental degradation that contributed to this transition, and particular deforestation near to major human settlements. So a combination of factors involved in terms of this putative rural to urban transition that has been talked about. Okay, the third topic I wanted to look at is that of rescaling urban epidemiology. And a number of interesting debates now around the question of scale in urban studies, urban planning, urban geography, which I've briefly touched on. And in particular, some of the neo-Lefebvrean arguments about planetary urbanization, which many of you will be familiar with. Part of the question for me, however, is how can we develop a multi-scalar approach? I mean, how might we, for example, conceptually combine some of the insights from the neo-Lefebvrean perspective with the small-scale socio-ecological specificities that are so important to understanding urban epidemiology? And in terms of thinking about particularly the field of work referred to as urban political ecology, with which my own work has been closely associated, if we were to develop this towards a sense of extended urbanization, what kind of patterns of urbanization might we contend with then through a notion of an extended urbanization? Clearly, one of these would be the proliferation of edge landscapes and other types of zoonotic spillover zones produced by intensified forms of ecological disturbance or fragmentation. A second element, which isn't widely explored, is that of the accelerated evolutionary dynamics occurring within modified or simplified environments, such as infrastructure systems or other kinds of closed ecosystems devoid of natural predators. So just an example here, the so-called brain-eating amoeba, which has contaminated water systems in Australia, Pakistan, and also Louisiana and other American states recently, and is thought to be associated with specific kinds of poorly maintained infrastructure systems within certain temperature ranges within which microorganisms such as the brain-eating amoeba can flourish. Also, thinking about the extended urbanization patterns, the need to engage very directly with the ecological sciences to make sense of some of these newly emerging socio-ecological assemblages. And additionally, in terms of extended urbanization, we could think in terms of zoonotic time-space compression between different components of the global biosphere as a concomitant element to the time-space compression that is familiar to us perhaps from some of the debates over the postmodern condition some years ago, advanced by David Harvey and other scholars. Now, a metabolic reading of epidemiological risk inevitably, I think, draws us to look at a variety of extractive frontiers and the intensified commodification of nature, not just through the extension of plantation agriculture, but also through the zoonotic dynamics of urbanization in relation to the illegal trade in wildlife and bushmeat, for example. So multiple factors here in terms of the extending commodification frontier in relation to zoonotic urbanization. And I think that we can think about deforestation hotspots to give a sense of where some of these extractive frontiers begin to intersect with potential zoonotic spillover zones. And in particular, I want to stress that in many ways, we confront a triple crisis spanning climate change, biodiversity loss, and the growing threat of new and emerging diseases. And one of the analytical challenges is really to bring these three different facets together in an effective way. So thinking then about extended conceptions of urbanization and its relationship to the Zoonotic City, I think inevitably means that we need to move away from these closed or systems-based conceptions of urban space, which it's worth pointing out, the systems-based conception of urban ecology and urban space remains the dominant epistemological perspective across most of the disciplines that we currently work in. So an interesting pedagogic challenge, if you like, is how do we open up these discourses to a wider range of perspectives, not just urban political ecology, but other alternative perspectives such as the multi-species city or the ecological pluriverse and other interesting conceptual frames. Yeah, so the final part of my talk then, the pandemic imaginary. I'm sure many of us have possibly even in our COVID isolation, out of curiosity, gone back to some of the cinematic representations of our current situation. And Soderbergh's film Contagion from 2011 presents a certain kind of pandemic imaginary in terms of this sense of panic, confusion, but also calling on now familiar epidemiological jargon, such as the R rate, but it also, in the context of Contagion, reproduces certain cultural topographic tropes in terms of zoonotic origins, which I'll return to shortly. At the start of my presentation, I mentioned Christos Linteris's elaboration of the idea of the pandemic imaginary, in which he builds on the insights of Cornelius Castoriadis and the imaginary as an instituting force of the social, a way of understanding and responding to complex aspects of social and cultural change. And in essence, looking at the work of Linteris and other scholars, the sense of the pandemic imaginary emerges from a pervasive anxiety over loss of control. A number of scholars have wrestled with this question of the loss of control or the loss of boundary under modernity. Esposito obviously is a key figure here in terms of the immunological paradigms of governmental structures and political responses. Equally, the recent work from Henrik Ernstsen and Eric Swingerdow, looking at the way in which late modernity, capitalist late modernity generates crises which it's incapable of controlling or responding to in a coordinated fashion. Possibly also we could link to the work of Ulrich Beck and the notion of reflexive modernization as well. And I think a moot point perhaps is whether we are now entering what we could refer to as late modernity. Being based here in Germany at the moment, I've been following some of the debates in German sociology, and there does seem to be a sense of confidence about the notion of late modernity as an identifiable periodization that we're currently residing within. And in terms of the sense of preparedness that sociologists such as Andrew Lakoff and others have referred to, there's a sense of developing operational criteria for response. But one of the key elements here in terms of thinking about the pandemic imaginary and various forms of preparedness, either at a nation state or an international level of coordination, is that preparedness raises systemic concerns with indicators such as hospital surge capacity, for example, rather than the structural determinants of corporeal vulnerability. So it's a heavily circumscribed way of understanding public health threats. Also, in terms of the pandemic imaginary, and this perhaps relates back to the Soderbergh's Contagion from 2011, the question of how the pandemic imaginary maps onto urban form. And there has been a particular emphasis on the cultural motif of the Chinese city or the East Asian city as a prominent location within the Euro-American epidemiological imagination. But as I mentioned at the start of my presentation, we need to be extremely careful about if you like, the topographic locus of the epidemic pandemic imaginary, simply because the causes of zoonotic threats are so varied and complex and extend into the landscapes of capitalist agriculture in the global north as well. And we need to really keep hold of these multiple geographies and be very cautious of the rendition of the urban other. I mean, I use this example because Stadtbauwelt is a prominent architectural journal in Germany, and it really intrigued me that their representation of Hong Kong, in this instance, 10 years after its post-colonial transition, really featured so many photographs of these extremely dense honeycomb structures that this formed part of a particular architectonic imaginary, and now, of course, has been revamped in a contemporary context. And from an anthropological perspective, the repeated debate about the idea of the so-called wet market in East Asian cities as the kind of the ground zero, as it were, or locus zero within a very particular kind of cultural imaginary, which I want to think about quite carefully. So to conclude then, I think that implicitly in developing a notion of the Zoonotic City, I feel in terms of the periodizations and epidemiological periodizations, I feel an intuitive draw towards the plantation scene as a better conceptual tool than the more generalized notion of the Anthropocene. And quite possibly, I think, through developing a critical epidemiological perspective, we are contributing to debates which are effectively against the Anthropocene as a kind of hegemonic conceptual perspective. I wanted also to leave you with a sense of the complexity of urban periodicities as well. And I think it's very instructive to me that when we talk about the high point of public health optimism through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, for example, that quietly and perhaps not really noticed within the context of the World Health Organization, particularly, or the Global North, major public health threats were already gathering momentum, in particular dengue fever, through the cities of Southeast Asia before its global spread. So additionally, I would say a narrowly topographic reading of urban epidemiology with the density trope risks obscuring a variety of material forms and structural relations that have underpinned the zoonotic dimensions to the global public health crisis. And just as a final remark, and then we'll open up to some questions and discussion, the question of I've really noticed in the literature, let's say, that the post-COVID city has been cropping up repeatedly across geography, planning, landscape design, literature, and so on. And I guess the first point I would make is my caution about trying to comment on things that are evolving in real time. And to be honest with you, I even held back from developing this particular argument I've developed in this presentation because of a certain reticence to trying to link together historical dynamics with contemporary developments and the analytical and methodological dangers that hold there. And I think I was also a little concerned perhaps by the range of very optimistic accounts of the post-COVID city and all of these transformations in work, mobility, green space that were confidently predicted to emerge from the current crisis. And my general sense that the post-COVID city will be similar to the one we have now, but slightly worse. I think that's probably my sense of where we're at in this sort of ongoing set of changes. And of course, the pandemic imaginary, as it connects with new geographies of anxiety and isolation, I think is an interesting cultural and ideological entry point into these debates. So yeah, apologies for a couple of technical glitches, and thank you for listening. And I think we have a bit of time now for questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for kind of bringing once again to our attention these kind of other geographies and other topographies of disease and especially of zoonotic disease, and kind of thinking in alternative ways about the kind of periodization of both disease and disease in the city. And I was thinking about this actually just yesterday because there was news reports from factory farms here in the United States where millions of those, there's been sort of large scale culling of chickens on these different factory farms in the last few days because of avian flu outbreaks. And then with that, the sort of simultaneous sort of firing in large numbers of the workers who are there. And again, this kind of really important reminder of the kind of those structural dynamics of late capitalism that you've been talking about, and how they pertain to these other geographies, these kind of sites of extended urbanization, these kind of edge conditions, as well as their relationships to broader global processes. And really like a reminder of the violence of those as well, both for people and for others. So I'll open it up with that to anyone who has questions. Please feel free to turn your camera on, to raise your hand, however you'd like to join into the discussion.
Nida, can I just very quickly respond to that comment you mentioned about the large-scale culling and also firing of workers? Um, you at the start of the presentation, you kindly mentioned my new book, and one of the things I looked at in that book was the history of abattoirs and violence towards nature, which was not a topic I intended to really talk about, but I became drawn to it. And the question of the ethical aspects to the treatment of nature and sentient beings in this particular case is something that has really troubled me over the last couple of years in terms of writing about what we understand by urban nature, and of course the political ecology of food in different dimensions. And it also occurs to me that the urban political ecology paradigm has not yet really engaged very systematically with ethical aspects of relations with the non-human, although there have been some advances in relation to agribusiness, industrialized agriculture, but I think there's a lot more important work to be done, I think.
Yeah, I think those ethical aspects tend to be sort of sometimes forgotten when we're kind of, when at the top of that epidemiological imaginaries you're talking about are things like pathogens and brain-eating viruses, or sort of mosquitoes even, which don't tend to kind of evoke those ethical considerations, but those broader dynamics get lost. So please, I invite anyone for questions. Hello.
I have a tentative question. It's not very well thought out, but in some of your work, you talk about, or in this talk, you mentioned the neo-Malthusian ideas of density and how that gets a lot of blame for disease and infection, and I definitely remember that before college, that was how it was explained to me. Climate change as well, like overpopulation was due to, climate change is highly due to overpopulation. So I guess was wondering if that's something that you come across a lot, having to fight against these ideas, or and how, I don't know, how do you respond to them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm not muted, am I? You can hear me. Okay. Yes, I think your question actually relates to something else I've been thinking about, and that is, we are developing our academic work, and in some cases our professional practice, and ideas about how we want to change the world, all of these different things. And one of the things that I wonder about is how difficult it is to change the way people think about things. And in terms of the fields of work that we're in, the fact that a systems-based conception of urbanization is pretty dominant across planning and landscape design and so on, and that the kind of fields that I've worked with, like urban political ecology, are very, very marginal within the kind of dominant educational or pedagogic structures of urban planning and so on. And I think it's a really interesting question, and even beyond these systems-based approaches, when we're in the realm of more, if you like, purely ideological neo-colonial discourse surrounding the application of ideas such as neo-Malthusianism to global crises, is how do we, as you rightly ask in your question, how can we articulate alternative perspectives that might hold some kind of traction in the public imagination, particularly in a context where academic discourse is effectively reduced to a sentence, if you're lucky, in terms of the kind of attention span of global mediascapes. And I'd perhaps just raise two things which I think can help us a little bit. I think one is the question of food and meat. And I think that discussions about the impact of meat on the planet, not just ethical aspects of the treatment of animals, but wider environmental or zoonotic consequences, I think these discussions about diet can potentially cut through so that people can begin to piece together, not in a superficial way, their personal choices, but in a more structured way, changes in diet and extractive frontiers and so on. I think the scope there to push that type of argument in an interesting way. The other thing I would say in relation to urban political ecology perspectives as an alternative radical perspective, sometimes I think this school of thought can be referred to in terms of following the money. Again, I think in terms of the public political imagination, it's understood what's implied by that. So that if we're looking at decisions that Nida just referred to with the mass firing of workers and things of that kind, and we actually look at corporate responses to both economic change and public health risk, following the money, who specifically benefits from different forms of environmental degradation, I think you can hold the public's attention in following through those arguments in the way that if you said, I'm now going to give an extended discussion about neo-Marxian urban theory, that's not going to work in terms of a kind of public arena. So I think that there are then, I think to, in a roundabout way to answer your question, I think that the way in which we frame arguments and our choice of terminology is important, but I do believe that it's possible to enrich the public realm. I don't take a fatalistic view of that.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Matthew, thank you. You talk quite richly about expanding our geographical conception from a European American centrism. And I think another dimension that's very important is expanding our time dimension. At least in America, Americans live culturally and politically in the moment. And to take an example from public health, it took almost 60 years from the invention of pasteurization to the widespread requirement that milk not be allowed to kill children, and that it be pasteurized. And exactly where you ended your prior comment is where pasteurization got introduced, because it became clear that people were getting rich off of killing children. And when you make that the narrative, pasteurization came through politically 60 years after it was invented scientifically. So I just wanted to add that dimension to your geographical emphasis, because it's easy to feel fatalistic when you live in the moment, particularly this moment. But if you look over time, over the course of the last century, public health has advanced significantly. You quite rightly speak about the excessive optimism, but we're supporting almost 8 billion people in a world that supported 2 billion people a century ago. And we're doing it, in a healthier way. My question for you is to ask you to elaborate on the idea of the post-COVID city, understanding that it's preliminary, as similar but less satisfactory than the pre-COVID city, because cities as a concept, however one defines the periphery of cities, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind, but urbanization is a character of human civilization. And as you quite rightly observe, it goes back to Neolithic times. So if I look at the city today versus the city 100 years ago, it's not clear to me that the Spanish flu had any effect on the character of urbanization. So I just wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that modest pessimism.
Okay. Well, maybe just quickly on your comment about time, just very quickly, I think it's very interesting what you said about this very long time period between these epidemiological debates within the biophysical sciences, as it were, then actually finding their way into a public policy response. I mean, another example from the realm of infrastructure is the way that catastrophic events can take decades to lead to fundamental engineering responses. So in some of my other work, the 1953 devastating floods in the Thames estuary, it took 30 years for the Thames barrier to be completed and operational. So this time aspect in relation to the kind of immediacy of the moment nature of contemporary discourse is a real issue, I think, to reflect on. And within the academy, I very much like these discussions about slow science and things of that kind. And if somebody tells me that they're working on a paper or book that's taken several years, I'm very supportive of that. You know, I want to give them the space and time to do that. In terms of the post-COVID city, one of the interesting debates has been, in relation to urban design, has been the 15-minute city, which caught my attention, and the walkable city and things of that kind. I think Carlos Marino, came up with this idea. And some optimistic talk about a permanent shift towards patterns of home working and things of that kind. And I think that what I'm worried about, nevertheless, is that if you like, the social structuring of society, the class-based dynamics, have also fed in to not only the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in a certain way accelerated incipient changes within stratification within modern or late modern societies. So that in a German context, I've been reading about the so-called new service class. So, people on precarious, low-paid contacts, often with repeated exposure to other people through the nature of their work, in a way, inhabiting a separate epidemiological sphere to the middle classes or professional classes who've been able to restructure and withdraw from spaces of danger and so on. So I guess one of my concerns then, in a way, is that some of the incipient stratigraphic changes within modern or late modern societies have become more pronounced and maybe more set through the COVID pandemic. I would also add, just simply from a personal point of view, that in the higher education sector, I'm intrigued by the way in which higher education managers have looked very carefully at some of the changes within teaching practices. And I get the sense, certainly in my country, there will be an attempt to perhaps take advantage of some of these changing practices as we emerge fully from the COVID-19 pandemic. So an immensely complicated set of developments. I think also, and I know I'm not answering your question perhaps as well as I should, but I think that some of the discourse about the post-COVID city has tended towards a kind of a design perspective. In what's the post-COVID city going to look like, or things of that kind, or what will it feel like? And I guess I'm worried in the final analysis whether many of these complex public health questions are essentially design questions at all. Design can certainly worsen situations, maybe ameliorate them in certain situations, but I think we're not fundamentally dealing with a design discourse in relation to the post-COVID city.
Thanks.
Holly, please go ahead.
Yes, two questions. What is the name of your latest book? And also, what do you think of the future of urban vertical farming as a possible solution to feeding people in heavily urbanized areas?
Right. So my book is called Natura Urbana. I think Nida has a copy she was waving earlier. So it's MIT Press if you're interested in it. And you mentioned vertical farming. Could you clarify for me what you mean by that, please?
Well, where you are using perhaps former very tall buildings, skyscrapers, to grow with minimal watering and so on. You're growing row after row of greens, which can be easily harvested and fed locally to the people. And you have watering that just trickles down, and it's a minimum of watering and a highly mechanized means of growing fresh greens.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think in principle it sounds extremely interesting. I think one of my worries, though, is that sometimes these approaches to urban greening rely on generic ecologies, and in a different context, they can present a problem. And an example that caught my attention was an award-winning tower block in Milan, which had sort of vertical greening, as it were, across the building. And when the same design was used in Chengdu in China, this same structure became a breeding ground for dengue-carrying mosquitoes, and these luxury apartments could not be sold. So that there was a tension then between what I referred to earlier, these socio-ecological specificities of a local context. So in principle, I think what you're suggesting is great, but I think that I would look carefully at this question of generic ecologies and what kind of agricultural practices would work and would also not pose an epidemiological threat in a different context.
Thank you.
Thank you. Junyo, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. Thank you, Matthew. I had a question. Like, sometimes we need media to intervene to raise some issue to make the government aware that we have some problem about some region. But how do you think like it is appropriate for the media to report an issue in a region without stigmatizing the region?
Sure. I mean, I think if you're talking about media or mediascapes, I think this partly relates to the question of journalism and science journalism in particular. And I feel that we need more really well-informed journalists who are excellent writers and communicators, because one of the big challenges in relation to COVID-19, but many other social, environmental, and health challenges is to have people who are able to understand and communicate effectively. As academics, we try in a limited way to achieve that, but fundamentally, we're not trained journalists. Maybe we'd like to be in a different life, but we need people out there who really know how to get specific ideas across. Sometimes, and it relates back to maybe to the speed question earlier, sometimes there are ways of advancing a complex idea in small parts sometimes, or in using different modes of communication. Sometimes documentary films can be very powerful in terms of conveying very complex ideas effectively. And I should maybe say affectively as well, because of the way an audience can be emotionally drawn in to a narrative structure that works effectively. So I think you pose an extremely interesting question, and I don't know if anybody in this class is thinking of going into environmental journalism of some kind, but if you are, good luck, because I think we need you to do that kind of work.
Thank you. I'm just interested about that.
Thank you. I think we're right at time, so unless someone has a very quick question, we might try to wrap up and thank Matthew again. Matthew, this was really, really fantastic. Thank you.